Alright, so I'm standing here in what's supposed to be my third food forest. Well, kind of. It's about a couple of months old, so if you were hoping for a lush paradise, you're a few seasons too early. But if you've spent more than 5 minutes going down the food forest rabbit hole, you already know how this goes. You start off excited, you read all the books, you watch all the videos, and before you know it, you've built a 50-page design, you've redrawn it 3 times, and you still haven't planted your first trees. So in this video, I'm going to share 4 key lessons that I've learned from planting food forest in 3 different climates that helped me break out of this planning trap and finally start my food forest. And here's what actually worked. Lesson 1. The perfect plan is killing your food forest. Have you ever had that moment where you're just standing on your land with a shovel in your hand, trying to figure out like where to start planting your first trees, and the next thing you know, an hour's gone by and nothing's planted? Well, truth be told, I've been there many times, and it's the same thing I see with a lot of people. They've got the land, they've got the ideas, but they're stuck trying to come up with the perfect layout before putting anything in the ground. And it's what I call the planning trap, and it's exactly what stops most food forests from ever getting started. So before we get into what to plant, where to plant it, and how to plant them, let's simplify it, because here's what trips most people up right out of the gate. The second you hear the word food forest or watch some video of a mature 10-year-old system, your brain instantly paints this fantasy. And I know, at least it did for me. You see all these different plants with all the fruits, the diversity, the production, like the whole deal. And yes, that's absolutely real. But here's the problem. It makes starting feel impossible. Like, you need to be some kind of permaculture wizard or have endless resources just to get going. But the truth is, a food forest isn't magic. It's just nature with a little bit of direction, like organized chaos really. And it's this chaos that can be overwhelming because it looks like everything is happening all at once. So let's simplify this whole thing. If you've been reading up on food forests, you know that it's just a way of growing food by copying what nature already does. You've got different plants, animals, insects, soil, all working together. And some plants in the system are there to feed you, some feed the soil, some attract pollinators, some grow fast so you can chop them and feed the others. And that's literally it. Now, you've probably seen those famous food forest charts with the 7 layers or 8 or 12, depending on who you ask. But you've got the tall trees, the smaller trees, the shrubs, vines, herbs, ground covers, and so on. And suddenly you think you need to figure it all out before you can plant anything. And that's just another version of the planning trap. Here's what actually matters. Most of the plants you want to grow, your fruit trees, berries, nuts, those are producers. They give you food, but they take a lot from the soil. They need lots of nutrients, water, care, and protection. They're basically the divas of the system, like the loquat right behind me. Now, imagine a whole system full of that, like full of divas. That's your typical orchard, and that's why they need constant spraying, fertilizing, and maintenance. And we don't want to do that in a food forest. In a food forest, we also need the givers or a support crew. These are the nitrogen fixers, the fast-growing plants that become mulch, and the plants that build soil, shade out the roots, and do all the behind-the-scenes work to keep your system healthy. And every healthy food forest needs both, the plants that feed you and the plants that feed the system. And this combination of different plants with different functions work together as a team. And this team of plants is what is called a guild, a small island of different plants with different heights and functions all working together. And I wrote about this in depth in our book, The One Guild, A Food Forest, which you can download below, but you can think of it like a bicycle. Your main fruit tree could be a fig, a mulberry, that's the frame. It's the center, but a frame alone doesn't go anywhere. It needs pedals, wheels, chains, a brake, and all the supporting parts that make it actually move forward. That's what the support plants are. Those are the ones that you plant around the tree, and together they form essentially a mini food forest. And here's the beauty of it. Once you have that first guild growing, you can plant the next one, and over time your system grows, and what you end up with is a large, diverse food forest made up of lots of small guilds essentially stitched together over time. And this approach simplifies everything from planning down to planting, because you don't need to have an entire 20-page design. All you need is one main tree and a support team around it. So let me show you exactly how that works. Lesson number 2, you're not building a forest, you're planting one patch at a time. Alright, so this spot right here, it might not look like much yet, but this is where one of our first guilds started. Here we have a custard apple that was planted roughly 5 to 7-ish years ago in the middle of a grassy field. There was no crazy prep done, no big designs, but just a single tree stuck in the ground. And the same pattern followed on the rest of this field. There were a few scattered trees around randomly, but it wasn't really a food forest. There was a lot of potential though, however, and what it needed was a structure, something that could turn into a system quickly if we started adding more plants from different layers and with different functions. So the producers and the givers, and start building individual teams. Now, in the past, I used to think I had to figure out everything before I started planting. Like, I needed to sit down and design the whole forest from end to end, every tree, every plant, every layer, all at once. And the problem with that approach is that often you second guess every decision and you end up planting nothing. But what I learned after doing this a few times in completely different climates is you don't need to design the whole forest, but you need to look at a couple of things before you plant. So let's take this custard apple for an example. Before we started adding a guild around this tree, I wanted to know like what the conditions were here. Like, where does the water flow? Are there any harsh winds that affect this area? What are the sun and shade conditions? Just some basic things really, like nothing complicated. I didn't draw any maps for weeks, I didn't run any calculations, but I did get a rough idea of what the conditions are in this specific zone. And once you have that, you can then zoom in and start thinking about what plants would make sense to add on to this system. So for example, in our case, we planted a combination of different species, some support species, biomass species, and more productive plants as well. Here we have a banana. It's a great plant for this climate. It grows relatively fast, produces wonderful fruit, but more importantly, especially in the beginning of a food forest, a ton of biomass that we can use to chop and drop and speed up the growth of the whole system. Next to the banana, we've got a Japanese ginger, the Myoga ginger, which is a relative of the more commonly known one. With this one, we don't eat the rhizomes, but it's producing edible shoots, young shoots and flowers. We also have some chives in there. Easy to grow, it attracts a lot of pollinators, it's a great use in the kitchen. Same for the rosemary right next to it, need no introduction. Then right next to it we also have a yacon, which is a herbaceous plant from the Andes, South America, and this one provides a ton of edible tubers, just like the taro over there. Easy to grow plant in this climate. We also have some calendula, some borage, to add some diversity and colors and attract beneficial insects. For the ground cover, we've got some sweet potatoes. Like, there's a whole bunch of different plants all interacting together, taking up different spaces within this young guild. And I could, well, keep on going, but basically you get the point. What we started doing here is we designed a simple guild around this main custard apple, and we did it with the plants that we had access to, and we just planted it. This is our first mini food forest. Right next to this custard apple we also have a loquat, and right here we did the exact same thing. Different tree, different support plants and slightly different conditions, but the same approach. We just look at the area, we observe the conditions, and we design a small system that works for this spot. We plant it, let it grow, we observe and adjust as needed. Some areas will fill in faster than others, and some might need a little more care. But the structure is building itself one guild at a time. And this is where it gets exciting, because over time, these individual guilds start to connect and expand into a larger food forest. And to make sure that we place these guilds where they will thrive based on how your land works, we do want to do a little bit of planning. But that doesn't mean locking yourself in analysis mode for months. It means observing your land, sketching out a simple layout, where the windbreak might go, where water collects, where the sun hits, and using that to decide where to place your first patch. Once that's done, you focus just on one guild. You design it, you plant it, you learn from it, and then you build the next one. You can think of it much in the same way as making a sourdough. You know, like you don't bake 100 loaves at once. You start with a little starter, you feed it, you use it, you keep it alive, and before you know it, you've got more than enough. Well, a guild is your starter. You plant one, you nurture it, you learn from it, and then you plant the next one. And before you know it, the system's growing itself. You don't need a food forest on day one. You need a simple system that you can repeat over time that works for your land. Which brings me to the next lesson. Lesson 3, you don't need a nursery, just use what you've got. 80% of the plants that I've planted here in this food forest in the last 3 months, I planted for free. 80%. The other 20% are mostly a few specialty trees that I really wanted to have, plus some seeds that I bought online. And when I say free, I don't mean like someone gifted me a whole nursery. I mean cuttings, seeds, pops, divisions, and stuff that I propagated myself or just found growing nearby. For example, this taro over here came from one of the roots that I put in a pot that I found alongside the road. The bananas over there, they came from a small plantation from a neighbor where he had a lot of pops and he wanted to get rid of them. And now they're everywhere here in our system. Same for the sweet potatoes that are growing under here as a ground cover. We just planted an organic sweet potato and we just let it grow and took all the slips and planted them everywhere. At home we've got lots of pigeon peas, albesias, acacias, leucaenas, all started from seeds that we sourced locally. Didn't cost me anything, and now it's feeding the soil, shading the ground and giving us biomass and food, all from a couple of seeds and cuttings. And to be honest, I'm not picky. If a neighbor's got something growing and they're happy to share a cutting, I'll take it. Right now I've got about I think something like 300 coffee beans germinating in trays at home, simply because one of my neighbors has a coffee bush, but she doesn't do anything with it herself. So we harvested them, we germinate them, and soon we can start our own little coffee plantation. You will be amazed at how much plant material is just around, like stuff people don't use, stuff growing wild, and once you learn to spot it, you realize that you can start a lot of plants without spending a ton of money. Same goes for fruits from the local store. Right now we've got about 30 or 40 avocado trees waiting to be planted. Some apricots we've got here, some papayas waiting to be transplanted simply because we ate the fruit and we planted the seeds. Now I know most of those won't grow true to type. You won't know what kind of a fruit you will get until they mature. But here's the thing, we've got literally hundreds of trees waiting to go in the ground for the same price of what normally one single tree would cost us if we bought it at the nursery. If a tree turns out to give us bad fruit, you know what? We can graft a known variety onto it. And if you have too many, you can just chop it and drop it in place and it becomes food for the trees that are doing great. And the same goes for mulch and fertility. Apart from adding a little bit of compost in the planting holes for the trees that we wanted to give a little bit of a head start, we didn't bring in truckloads of compost or wood chips or fertilizers. We plant this entire food forest directly in the existing grass field. All the mulch that we have here is just chopped up grass clippings, weeds that we keep pulling, leaves and branches that we prune from existing trees, and we just drop it right on the ground. Like every weed that I pull becomes mulch. That's free organic matter, it's free fertility, and yes, it's a little bit messy, but it works. Now, back when I first started, I used to stress so much about getting loads of straw bales like wood chips and all that, and hey, if you've got access to it locally, go for it, use it, but it's not a requirement. You can still get great results with a really lean setup. You don't need all the plants, you don't need the perfect mulch, you don't need ideal conditions, you just need to start with what you've got, because the second something goes in the ground, even just a few plants with a little bit of mulch, the whole system will start to shift. Now you've got some momentum, now the space is actually doing something. And yeah, some plants will thrive, some won't, some will get eaten and some will die back in dry weather. That's all part of it. But I've never once regretted planting. You can always replace a plant later. What you can't replace is the time that you lost waiting for the perfect plant. So get creative, look around, use whatever you've got access to, grab a shovel and just start planting. That's enough to get started. Having said that, what you plant, especially in the beginning, matters a lot, which brings me to the next lesson. Lesson number 4, overplant support, underplant producers. Okay, so I learned this the hard way. When I first got into food forest, I planted way too many fruit trees, like way too many. I was excited, I wanted to have like apples, pears, figs, cherries, mangoes, depending on where I was living, and I figured the more trees the better, right? So I filled the land with fruit trees. But here's the thing, I didn't plant much around them. No support species, no nitrogen fixers, barely any mulch producing plants. It was just fruit trees standing alone. And guess what happened? Well, they grew slowly, they stayed small, and I spent a lot, like a ridiculous amount of time hauling in mulch, straw, wood chips, compost, just to keep them happy, because I hadn't planted anything that could feed the system. Now compared to this spot right here, this right here is a young walnut tree, which was already here when we arrived, and I don't know whether we'll keep it in the system long term, because it's allelopathic and generally not a great performer in this climate. Anyway, it's a great example to use here. So it's the same idea. It's a heavy feeding, nut producing tree that takes a lot from the soil. But look around it, like we've got bananas, we've got paulownias, we've got albizzias, acacias, sweet potatoes, nasturtium, rosemaries, like all planted around it. And all the mulch that's in this system all came from here. We didn't import a thing. Everything was just chopped and dropped in place, and now this tree is doing much better. So, as I mentioned earlier, the fruit trees are takers, and if you plant them alone, like I did early on, they struggle, they're exposed, they're hungry, and you're stuck doing all the work for them. But the pioneer support species are the givers. They grow fast, they build soil, they provide shade, they suppress weeds, and most importantly, they give you endless amounts of biomass to feed the system. So every time I plant a new food forest, I overplant the support species, I go heavy on the mulch makers, the nitrogen fixers and the fast growers, because they make life easier and they pave the way for the producers. And once you've got that abundance of support species, you've got free mulch every time you chop. You've got fertility cycling right on site. You've got trees that are sheltered, that are shaded and fed without you running around having to haul in materials. And the more support plants that you grow, the more materials that you've got to chop. And every time you drop it, you're feeding your trees, you're protecting the soil, and you're building a food forest that eventually can take care of itself. So the question I often get is like, what's the right balance between support and productive species? And honestly, there's no real number that says like you need 10 support species for every one producer. But here's a way to think about it. Whenever you are starting from scratch, in the beginning, you can go crazy and plant as much as maybe up to 90% support and only 10% productive. But as the system matures, you continue to prune back the support species, and over time, you might end up with 90% productive trees and only 10% or even less of support species. Again, this is not a rule set in stone, but it's just a way to reframe of how to think about establishing a food forest. If there's one thing over the years that I've learned is that you can't really overdo it with the support species, because you can always keep pruning them back, chop them and drop them in place until the fruiting trees take over. That's how you manage a succession in a food forest, and this is how you go from constantly tending your plants to managing a self-feeding system. And once you get into the flow of it, it actually gets easier and the system starts doing most of the work. You just give it a little bit of a nudge every now and then. And that's how a food forest feeds itself. So when you take a step back and really look at it all, that's what I love so much about the one guild food forest. You can just start with one guild, maybe 2, 3 or 5 of them, like whatever fits your season, your time and your budget. And you can literally start this weekend with just a handful of plants, because one single guild is essentially a mini food forest, and a big productive food forest is simply a combination of several smaller guilds that are added over time. And once you start to think in those terms, everything gets simpler. And I talk more about this in detail in the One Guild Food Forest guide, which you can download below. But once you start to simplify things this way, the question isn't anymore like how do I design a full food forest, it becomes how do I design and start my first guild that I can then replicate over and over and over again with different plants on my land until it becomes a large food forest. And if you want to see how I design a guild step by step, then make sure to watch this video next.